The white door on the second floor of Edmund Hale's house in Providence, Rhode Island, hadn't been opened in 3 years. Not since the day Clara left this world, taking with her the warmth that had once filled every corner of their Victorian home. Edmund had turned the key that final time with trembling fingers, sealing away not just her belongings, but the memories that felt too heavy to bear. The neighborhood whispered about the reclusive widower who lived behind drawn curtains. They noticed how the once pristine garden had surrendered to weeds, how newspapers piled up on his porch until he finally emerged to collect them in silence. What they couldn't see was the man inside, drowning in a pride so fierce it had become his prison. At 72, Edmund moved through his days like a ghost haunting his own life. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked time with hollow chimes, the only sound that broke the oppressive silence. His morning ritual was mechanical, black coffee in Clara's favorite mug, though he couldn't bring himself to admit why he chose it. Newspapers spread across the kitchen table, their words blurring together as his mind wandered to the locked door upstairs. The house itself seemed to mourn. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of light that managed to slip through the heavy curtains. The hardwood floors, once polished to a warm glow by Clara's careful hands, now creaked with neglect. Even the walls appeared faded, as if the joy that had once bounced between them had simply evaporated. Edmund's world had shrunk to the ground floor, kitchen, living room, and his worn leather armchair, where he spent most evenings staring at a television that offered no real escape. He ordered groceries online, avoided phone calls from his few remaining friends, and built walls higher than any grief counselor could scale. Pride, he told himself, was all he had left. Pride in maintaining his independence, in not burdening others with his sorrow, in keeping his pain private and dignified. But pride, as Edmund was about to learn, sometimes opens the door when love has lost the key. It was a bitter January night when the wind howled through Providence like a living thing, rattling windows and sending trash cans rolling down empty streets. Edmund sat in his chair, a blanket draped over his shoulders when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to his carefully constructed silence. A meow, rough and desperate, cutting through the storm's fury. At first, he ignored it. Neighborhood cats weren't his concern, but the crying persisted, growing more urgent with each gust of wind. Finally, annoyed more than concerned, Edmund shuffled to the back door and flicked on the porch light. There, huddled against the doorframe, was a cat unlike any he'd seen in Providence. Its coat was a striking blue-gray, almost silver in the harsh light, and its amber eyes held an intelligence that made Edmund pause. The animal was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, but those eyes never left his face. They seemed to look right through him, past his defenses, straight to the loneliness he'd worked so hard to hide. "Go on," Edmund muttered, making a shooing gesture. "Find somewhere else." The cat didn't move. Instead, it let out another meow, this one softer but somehow more insistent. The wind picked up again, driving rain across the porch, and Edmund watched the small creature press itself lower against the door. Something in that moment broke through his carefully maintained indifference. Maybe it was the cat's refusal to flee, or maybe it was the recognition of another soul weathering a storm. Whatever the reason, Edmund found himself stepping aside. The cat didn't need a second invitation. It slipped past him with surprising grace for such a bedraggled creature, and began exploring the house as if it had been invited for tea. Edmund watched in amazement as the animal walked confidently down the hallway, sniffing at corners and doorways with the air of a prospective buyer. Then it did something that made Edmund's breath catch. The cat climbed the stairs Edmund himself rarely used anymore, and walked directly to the locked door. It sat down in front of the white-painted wood and looked back at him with those penetrating amber eyes. "How did you—" Edmund started, then stopped himself. It was just a cat. Cats were curious creatures. There was nothing supernatural about it choosing that particular door to investigate, but as he watched the animal settle into a comfortable position against the doorframe, Edmund felt something shift in his chest. A name came to him, unbidden and certain. Harbor. Safe harbor. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had closed himself off from all safe harbors was now looking at a cat he'd somehow named for the very thing he'd rejected. "Harbor," he said aloud, testing the name. The cat's ears perked up, and it began to purr, a sound Edmund hadn't heard in his house for 3 years. That night, Edmund went to bed expecting to find the cat gone by morning, Surely it would realize this wasn't a home where joy lived anymore, and move on to a house with children's laughter, and warm radiators, and people who remembered how to love. But when dawn broke grey and cold over Providence, Harbour was exactly where Edmund had left him, curled up against the locked door, as if guarding something precious. The cat opened one amber eye as Edmund approached with a bowl of water and some leftover chicken, acknowledged the offering with a dignified nod, and returned to his vigil. "You can't stay here," Edmund said, though his voice lacked conviction. "This isn't a place for living things. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow." Harbour began to groom himself, paying no attention to the declaration. His methodical washing seemed to say, quite clearly, that he would be the judge of where he belonged. And so began the strangest standoff of Edmund Hale's life. Each morning he would wake to find Harbour in the same position, faithfully guarding a door that contained nothing but dust and heartache. Each evening the cat would follow him downstairs for dinner, then return to his post upstairs. It was as if Harbour understood something Edmund couldn't or wouldn't see. The cat's presence began to create small cracks in Edmund's carefully constructed isolation. He found himself talking to Harbour, at first just practical observations about food and weather, then gradually more personal thoughts that had been echoing in his head for years. "She loved that room," he admitted one evening, watching Harbour's ears swivel toward the sound of his voice. "Spent hours in there reading, writing letters to her sister in California. Said it was her sanctuary." Harbour's purr seemed to encourage more. "I can't go back in there," Edmund continued, surprised by his own honesty. Too much of her is still in there. And I'm not ready. I don't think I'll ever be ready." The cat regarded him with those knowing eyes, then did something that made Edmund's throat tighten. Harbour walked over to where Edmund sat on the top step and pressed his warm body against his leg. The simple gesture of comfort, the first he'd received in years, nearly undid him. That night, for the first time since Clara's death, Edmund didn't fall asleep to the sound of his own loneliness. Instead, he drifted off to the gentle rumble of Harbour's purring, a sound that seemed to promise that some doors, even the most carefully locked ones, were meant to be opened. But as Edmund was about to discover, Harbour's methods of persuasion were just beginning, and the blue-grey cat with the amber eyes had a persistence that would challenge everything Edmund thought he knew about pride, grief, and the courage it takes to live again. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, sliding through the mail slot with the weight of unwanted authority. Edmund recognized the official letterhead of the Providence Neighborhood Association before he even unfolded the crisp white paper. His hands shook slightly as he read the formal language that boiled down to a simple ultimatum: fix your property or face significant fines, unsightly conditions, property values, community standards. The words blurred together as Edmund's chest tightened. He crumpled the letter and threw it toward the wastebasket, missing by several feet. Harbour, who had taken to following him on his morning routines, padded over to investigate the discarded paper. "It's nothing," Edmund muttered, though his face burned with embarrassment. "Just busybodies with nothing better to do." But even as he said it, Edmund knew they were right. He couldn't remember the last time he'd really looked at his house from the outside. Through Clara's eyes, it had always been perfect. The white picket fence she'd insisted on painting every spring, the flower boxes that exploded with color from May through October, the front porch where they'd shared morning coffee and evening wine. Now, seeing it through the eyes of concerned neighbors, Edmund felt shame creep up his neck. The fence was grey with neglect, several pickets hanging at odd angles. The flower boxes were filled with dead stems and debris. Even the porch, their sanctuary, was cluttered with unopened packages and newspaper bundles he'd been too overwhelmed to manage. Harbour seemed to sense his distress. The cat rubbed against Edmund's legs, then walked to the front window and stood on his hind legs, paws pressed against the glass, as if trying to show him something outside. "Do you think I should clean up, do you?" Edmund asked, scratching behind Harbour's ears. The cat purred but didn't move from the window. For 3 days, Edmund stared at the crumpled letter, which Harbour had retrieved and placed pointedly on the kitchen table. The fine print mentioned a community inspection scheduled for the following week. The thought of strangers judging his property, judging him, made his stomach churn. But the alternative was even worse. Official fines, more letters, possibly even legal action. It was Harbour who finally pushed him over the edge. On Thursday afternoon, the cat disappeared for several hours, an absence that left Edmund more anxious than he cared to admit. He found himself checking the windows, listening for familiar paws on the hardwood floors, even calling Harbour's name, something he hadn't done since that first night. Harbour returned at sunset, bursting through the cat flap Edmund had reluctantly installed, covered head to tail in dead leaves, twigs, and what appeared to be several seasons' worth of garden debris. He looked like a walking advertisement for everything wrong with Edmund's yard. "What have you been doing?" Edmund demanded, though he couldn't suppress a smile at the cat's bedraggled appearance. Harbour sat down and began grooming himself with the dignity of someone who had accomplished important work. Looking at Harbour's leaf-covered form, Edmund saw his own neglect reflected in miniature. The proud, beautiful cat deserved better than to play in a wasteland of his own making. And Clara, God, what would Clara think if she could see what he'd let happen to their home? The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of February day that promises spring is still months away. Edmund stood at his front door for a full 10 minutes, his hand on the knob, gathering courage he hadn't needed in years. When he finally stepped outside, the magnitude of his neglect hit him like a physical blow. The yard that had once been the envy of Federal Hill was a disaster. 3 years of New England weather had taken their toll on everything Clara had lovingly cultivated. The rose bushes she'd tended with such care were overgrown and tangled with dead vines. The small vegetable garden where they'd grown tomatoes and herbs was a patch of weeds and winter-killed debris, but it was the front porch that made Edmund's chest tighten with grief. Clara's rocking chair sat empty, its white paint peeling in long strips. The small table where she'd kept her morning coffee and evening reading had warped so badly it tilted at an alarming angle. Even the welcome mat, which had once cheerfully greeted visitors with "Home Sweet Home," was faded and torn. Harbour appeared beside him, pressing against his legs in silent support. The cat's presence gave Edmund the strength to take the first step, then another, until he was standing in what had once been Clara's pride and joy. "Okay," he said aloud, his breath visible in the cold air. "Okay, we can do this." The work was harder than Edmund remembered. His 72-year-old body protested every movement as he raked dead leaves, pulled stubborn weeds, and wrestled with overgrown branches. His back ached, his hands developed blisters despite his gloves, and more than once he had to stop to catch his breath. But Harbour was there every step of the way. The cat seemed to understand the importance of the task, staying close enough to offer encouragement, but far enough away to avoid the tools and debris. When Edmund's energy flagged, Harbour would appear with a stick or leaf in his mouth, as if contributing to the cleanup effort. The first breakthrough came when Edmund tackled the front porch. As he swept away months of accumulated debris, he uncovered Clara's favorite coffee mug, somehow overlooked and left outside since the previous spring. It was chipped and stained, but whole. Edmund held it in his hands, remembering countless mornings when Clara had sipped her coffee from it while planning their day. Instead of the crushing grief he expected, Edmund felt something lighter, a warmth that had nothing to do with the physical work and everything to do with connection. Clara had loved this space, had found joy in every blooming flower and visiting bird. Letting it decay wasn't honoring her memory, it was betraying it. By the end of the day, Edmund had made a visible dent in the cleanup. The porch was clear, several bags of debris sat ready for collection, and the worst of the overgrown vegetation had been cut back. It wasn't perfect, not even close to Clara's standards, but it was a start. As sunset painted the sky orange and pink, Edmund sat on the porch steps with Harbour curled up beside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't focused on what was missing from his life. Instead, he was thinking about what might be possible. "You know what, Harbour?" he said, scratching the cat's chin. "Maybe they were right to send that letter. Maybe it's time to stop hiding." Harbour purred his agreement, and Edmund realized something had fundamentally shifted. The locked door upstairs still held its secrets, and his heart still carried its burden of grief. But for the first time since Clara's death, Edmund Hale was thinking about tomorrow instead of yesterday. The neighborhood association's inspection was still days away, but Edmund was no longer dreading it. Instead, he was planning. There were flowers to plant, fence boards to replace, and a house that needed to remember how to welcome the world again. And watching Harbour clean his paws with meticulous care, Edmund understood that some transformations begin not with grand gestures, but with the simple act of stepping outside your own front door. The inspection had gone better than Edmund dared hope. Mrs. Patterson from the Neighborhood Association had walked his property with clipboard in hand, making notes he couldn't read from her position beside him. But her expression had softened as she took in the cleared porch, the trimmed bushes, and the obvious effort he'd put into restoring order to his small corner of Providence. "Mr. Hale," she'd said as she prepared to leave, "this is quite an improvement. I can see you've put a lot of work into this." Edmund had nodded, not trusting his voice. It had been months since anyone in the neighborhood had spoken to him with anything approaching kindness. "If you need any help with the bigger projects, the fence repair perhaps, there are several neighbors who volunteered for community improvement efforts. Just call the association office." After she left, Edmund had sat on his porch with Harbour in his lap, marveling at the simple pleasure of a conversation that didn't end in embarrassment or frustration. But Mrs. Patterson's offer of help sat uneasily with him. He'd managed the cleanup himself, hadn't he? He didn't need charity from neighbors he barely knew. Harbour seemed to have different ideas. It started with small acts of what Edmund could only call sabotage. The cat would disappear for hours, returning with strange objects: a child's chalk from somewhere down the street, a garden glove that clearly belonged to someone else, even a small American flag that must have come from another yard's flower bed. "Where are you getting this stuff?" Edmund asked, examining a rubber ball that Harbour had deposited on the kitchen table. The cat simply blinked slowly and walked away, tail held high with satisfaction. The mystery deepened when Edmund began finding notes tucked into his mailbox, written in childish handwriting. "My mom says your cat is very friendly. I'm Sarah from the Blue House. Harbour played with our dog yesterday. Thank you for sharing him. The Rodriguez family. Your cat helped me find my lost bracelet. He's very smart. Mrs. Chen from next door." Edmund read these notes with growing bewilderment. When had Harbour been visiting the neighbors? And more puzzling still, when had the neighborhood cats become a source of joy rather than annoyance for these families? The answer came on a sunny Saturday morning in March, when Edmund looked out his kitchen window to see Harbour in Mrs. Chen's garden, carefully stepping between rows of early spring vegetables, while a small girl, presumably Sarah from the Blue House, giggled and tried to follow his precise path. "Harbour," Edmund called, stepping onto his porch. The cat looked up, murmured a greeting, and continued his inspection of Mrs. Chen's lettuce seedlings. "Don't worry about it, Mr. Hale," came a voice from the next yard. Mrs. Chen emerged from her back door carrying a watering can and wearing a smile that transformed her usually serious face. "He's been helping me keep the rabbits away. Very effective, your Harbour." Edmund felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize he was bothering you." "Bothering?" Mrs. Chen laughed. "He's the best garden assistant I've ever had, and Sarah here has been learning about vegetables because of him. Haven't you, dear?" Sarah nodded enthusiastically, her dark curls bouncing. "Harbour showed me which plants the bunnies like best. We're protecting them together." As Edmund watched his cat supervise a 7-year-old's gardening lesson, he felt something twist in his chest. This was what he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Connection, community, the messy, beautiful reality of lives intersecting in unexpected ways. "Mr. Hale," Mrs. Chen's voice was gentle. "Would you like some coffee? Sarah's grandmother is visiting, and she makes the most wonderful Korean pastries." The invitation hung in the air like a bridge Edmund could either cross or burn. His instinct was to decline, to retreat to his house and his solitude. But Harbour chose that moment to walk over and wind around Edmund's legs, purring loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. Edmund started, then stopped. When was the last time he'd shared a meal with another person? When was the last time he'd tasted anything more complex than his own basic cooking? "That would be nice," he heard himself say. "Thank you." The next hour passed like something from another life. Mrs. Chen's mother-in-law, a tiny woman named Mrs. Park, spoke limited English, but communicated volumes through gestures, smiles, and an apparently endless supply of homemade treats. Sarah chatted about school, her friends, and Harbour's daily visits with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never learned that adults sometimes preferred silence. Edmund found himself laughing, actually laughing, when Sarah described Harbour's technique for stalking leaves in the wind. The sound felt rusty and strange in his throat, but Mrs. Chen's approving nod suggested it wasn't as out of practice as he'd feared. "Your Harbour is special cat," Mrs. Park said in careful English, offering Edmund another pastry. "He know things. understand people. Edmund looked through the kitchen window to where Harbour was now supervising the Rodriguez family's children as they played in their backyard. The cat sat like a dignified referee, occasionally moving to redirect a child who was straying too close to Mrs. Chen's vegetables. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. How long has he been visiting everyone? Edmund asked. Since February, Mrs. Chen replied. Right after you started working on your yard. It's like he decided the neighborhood needed, what's the word? Ambassadoring. Ambassadoring isn't a word, Mom, Sarah giggled. It's being an ambassador, Mrs. Chen smiled. Yes, that. Harbour is being ambassador for you, Mr. Hale. The words hit Edmund like a gentle slap. While he'd been focused on maintaining his isolation, Harbour had been building bridges he didn't even know needed building. The cat had somehow understood what Edmund couldn't, that healing didn't happen in isolation, but in connection. But with understanding came a familiar surge of pride and defensiveness. He didn't need Harbour to make friends for him. He was perfectly capable of managing his own relationships, or lack thereof. I should get him home, Edmund said, standing abruptly. I don't want him to become a nuisance. Mrs. Chen and her mother-in-law exchanged a look that Edmund pretended not to notice. Of course, Mrs. Chen said carefully, but he's welcome here any time. We all enjoy his visits. Edmund thanked them for the coffee and pastries, called Harbour, and walked home feeling more confused than he had in months. The cat trotted beside him contentedly, showing no signs of guilt or concern about his unauthorized neighborhood diplomacy. That evening, as Edmund sat in his armchair with Harbour curled up nearby, he found himself thinking about Mrs. Park's words. He know things, understand people. Was it possible that Harbour could sense something Edmund was missing, some need or opportunity that his own grief had blinded him to? The question followed him to bed and was waiting when he woke up. Over breakfast, he found himself studying Harbour more carefully, looking for signs of the wisdom Mrs. Park claimed to see. The cat ate his breakfast with typical feline focus, then sat by the front door and chirped. It wasn't Harbour's usual meow, but a specific sound Edmund had heard before. A sound that meant quite clearly, "Let's go outside." Against his better judgment, Edmund opened the door. Harbour trotted out confidently, then stopped and looked back with obvious expectation. When Edmund didn't follow, the cat walked back, bumped against his legs, and headed for the door again. "You want me to come with you?" Edmund asked. Harbour's response was to walk purposefully toward Mrs. Chen's house, tail held high like a flag. Despite himself, Edmund followed. What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about his neighborhood, his neighbors, and the quiet revolution Harbour had been orchestrating while Edmund wasn't paying attention. Mrs. Chen wasn't the only one who'd been receiving Harbour's diplomatic visits. As they walked through the neighborhood, Edmund learned that Harbour had been helping elderly Mr. Kowalski with his newspaper delivery when arthritis made bending difficult. He'd been providing comfort to the Johnson family's sick child, somehow knowing when the boy needed quiet company. He'd even been assisting teenage Maria Rodriguez with her anxiety about walking to school alone, appearing each morning to escort her to the bus stop. Each story came with the same theme. Harbour had seen a need and found a way to help. More importantly, he'd done it all while representing Edmund, introducing him to his neighbors not through formal meetings or awkward conversations, but through the simple act of caring. By the time they returned home, Edmund felt as if he'd been seeing his neighborhood through new eyes. These weren't strangers judging his grief or his property maintenance. They were people facing their own challenges, finding their own ways to build community and connection. "You've been busy," he said to Harbour as they settled on the front porch. The cat purred and began grooming himself, the picture of innocent satisfaction. But Edmund's newfound appreciation for Harbour's diplomatic skills was about to face its biggest test yet, because that afternoon brought a visitor who would challenge not just his growing comfort with his neighbors, but his fundamental beliefs about independence, pride, and the courage it takes to accept help when you need it most. The knock on his front door came just as Edmund was considering what to make for dinner. Harbour's ears perked up immediately, and he trotted to the door with unmistakable excitement. When Edmund opened it, he found a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and work-worn hands holding a covered dish that smelled like heaven. "Mr. Hale, I'm Jennifer Martinez from Blessed Sacrament Parish. Harbour's been visiting our community garden, and we wanted to thank you." Edmund stared at her, then at Harbour, who was purring loudly enough to wake the entire neighborhood. The cat had somehow managed to expand his diplomatic mission to include the local church, and as Jennifer Martinez began explaining how Harbour had been helping their volunteer gardeners plant vegetables for the food pantry, Edmund realized his cat hadn't just been making friends. He'd been building something much more significant, a community that included Edmund, whether he'd asked for it or not. The question was whether Edmund had the courage to accept what Harbour had so carefully constructed, or whether his pride would tear down everything the wise blue-gray cat had built. Jennifer Martinez's casserole dish seemed to glow in the afternoon light as she stood on Edmund's front porch, waiting for his response. Harbour wound around her legs like an old friend, purring with the satisfaction of a matchmaker whose plans were finally coming together. "I'm not sure I understand," Edmund said, though part of him was beginning to suspect he understood perfectly. "Harbour's been visiting your church?" Jennifer's smile was warm but not patronizing. "Not exactly the church, Mr. Hale. Our community garden behind the parish hall. We started it last year to grow fresh vegetables for the food pantry. And Harbour, well, he's become our unofficial supervisor." She gestured to the covered dish in her hands. "This is from vegetables Harbour helped us harvest. Consider it a thank you gift from all of us." Edmund accepted the dish automatically, his mind racing. A community garden. Harbour had been volunteering at a community garden while Edmund had been struggling to maintain his own small yard. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he wasn't sure whether to laugh or feel embarrassed. "I should explain," Jennifer continued, seeming to sense his confusion. "We have volunteers who come after work and on weekends to help maintain the garden. Many of them are elderly, some have mobility issues, and a few are, well, let's say they're dealing with their own challenges. Harbour seems to know exactly when someone needs encouragement or when we're about to make a mistake with the plants." She paused, studying Edmund's face. "Mrs. Jen mentioned that you used to have beautiful gardens, and Harbour's behavior suggests he learned about plants somewhere. We were wondering, would you be interested in sharing some of your knowledge with our volunteers?" The invitation hit Edmund like a punch to the solar plexus. Teaching? Sharing knowledge? He hadn't taught anyone anything since Clara died, hadn't shared his gardening experience with anyone except Harbour during their yard cleanup conversations. "I don't think," he started, but Harbour chose that moment to chirp loudly and fix him with those knowing amber eyes. "You don't have to decide right now," Jennifer said quickly, "but if you'd like to visit the garden, see what we're doing, you'd be very welcome. Harbour could show you around." She smiled. "He seems to know the layout better than most of our regular volunteers." After Jennifer left, Edmund sat at his kitchen table, staring at the casserole dish. The aroma rising from beneath the foil cover was incredible. A rich blend of tomatoes, herbs, and what smelled like fresh basil. His stomach growled, reminding him that he'd been living on simple meals for far too long. Harbour jumped onto the table and sat directly in front of the dish, his meaning clear. All right, Edmund muttered, finding a serving spoon. "Let's see what your garden friends can do." The first bite transported him. The vegetables were perfectly cooked, the seasonings complex and balanced. But more than that, Edmund could taste something he'd almost forgotten. The love that went into growing food from seed to harvest. The care that transformed simple ingredients into nourishment for both body and soul. "This is from your garden?" he asked Harbour, who was watching his reaction with obvious pride. "The garden where you've been volunteering without mentioning it to me?" Harbour's purr suggested he was completely unrepentant about his secret charitable work. That night, Edmund found himself thinking about Jennifer's invitation. It had been years since anyone had asked for his expertise about anything. During his marriage to Clara, he'd been known throughout their neighborhood for his garden knowledge. People would stop by for advice about pest control, soil preparation, or which varieties grew best in Rhode Island's challenging climate. He'd loved those conversations, the sense of being useful, of having knowledge worth sharing. When had he stopped believing that what he knew had value to others? The answer was obvious. When Clara died, he'd shut down not just his grief, but everything connected to the life they'd built together, including his passion for gardening, his willingness to help neighbors, his belief that he had anything meaningful to contribute. Harbour had been watching him wrestle with these thoughts, and the next morning, the cat made his intentions clear. Instead of their usual routine, Harbour sat by the front door and uttered that specific chirp that meant adventure. "You want to visit your garden, don't you?" Edmund asked. Harbour's response was to paw at the door handle with increasing urgency. "Fine," Edmund said, surprising himself, "but just a quick look. I'm not committing to anything." The walk to Blessed Sacrament Parish took 15 minutes through tree-lined streets Edmund hadn't explored in years. Harbour trotted ahead confidently, occasionally stopping to wait for Edmund to catch up, like a tour guide ensuring his group stayed together. The community garden was tucked behind the parish hall, a quarter-acre of raised beds, composters and tool sheds that spoke of serious commitment to growing food. Even in early April, Edmund could see signs of careful planning. Cold frames protecting tender seedlings, properly prepared soil waiting for warm weather crops, and a sophisticated irrigation system that suggested someone knew what they were doing. But it was the people that made Edmund pause. 3 elderly volunteers were working in different sections of the garden, moving slowly but purposefully among the beds. A young mother with a toddler was teaching her child to sprinkle seeds into carefully prepared rows. 2 teenagers, who should have been anywhere but a church garden on a Saturday morning, were discussing the best spacing for summer squash with the seriousness of agricultural scientists. Harbour announced their arrival with a loud meow that brought immediate responses from around the garden. "Harbour's here," called the young mother, "and he brought a friend." "That must be Mr. Hale," said one of the elderly volunteers, a woman whose arthritic hands didn't seem to slow her planting technique. "Harbour's been telling us all about you." Edmund felt his cheeks flush. "I'm just looking around." But as he watched the volunteers work, he found himself noticing things. A tomato seedling that was being planted too deep, lettuce rows that were spaced too closely together, a pepper plant that showed signs of overwatering. His hands began to itch with the urge to help, to share what he knew, to prevent the mistakes he could see forming. Harbour seemed to sense his internal struggle. The cat walked purposefully to the tomato planter, Mrs. Sullivan according to her name tag, and began pawing at the soil around the seedling she'd just placed. "What is it, Harbour?" Mrs. Sullivan asked. "Is something wrong?" The cat looked directly at Edmund, then back at the plant, then at Edmund again. His meaning couldn't have been clearer if he'd spoken English. "Tell her." Edmund found himself walking over before he'd consciously decided to move. "The stem," he heard himself say. "You want to bury more of the stem. Tomatoes will grow roots from any part of the stem that's underground. It makes them stronger." Mrs. Sullivan looked up at him with bright interest. "Really? I had no idea." Like this. For the next hour, Edmund found himself moving from bed to bed, answering questions, offering suggestions and sharing knowledge he'd accumulated over decades of gardening. The volunteers were genuinely interested, grateful for his expertise, and completely uninterested in his personal circumstances or his 3-year hiatus from social interaction. Harbour supervised it all, positioning himself where he could keep an eye on both Edmund and whichever volunteer currently had his attention. Occasionally the cat would walk to a specific plant or area, clearly directing Edmund's focus to problems he might not have noticed otherwise. "You have a remarkable cat," said Father Michael, the parish priest who had appeared sometime during Edmund's impromptu consulting session. "He's been a blessing to our garden community." Edmund looked around at the volunteers, who were now implementing his suggestions with enthusiasm and careful attention to detail. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely useful. Not just useful, needed. "A haze full of surprises," Edmund admitted, watching Harbour demonstrate to the teenagers how to check soil moisture by digging a small hole with his paw. "Would you consider coming back next week?" Father Michael asked. "We meet every Saturday morning, and it's clear you have knowledge our volunteers could really benefit from." The question that had seemed impossible when Jennifer first asked it now felt almost inevitable. These people needed help, had gardens that needed tending, were growing food that would feed families in need. How could he let his pride stand in the way of something so clearly beneficial? "I suppose I could," Edmund said, then caught himself. "I mean, yes, I'd like to help." As they walked home that afternoon, Harbour practically bounced with satisfaction. The cat had orchestrated another breakthrough, another step toward the life he seemed determined to build for Edmund. But that evening, as Edmund sat on his front porch reflecting on the day, he realized something profound had shifted. For the first time since Clara's death, he had somewhere to go next Saturday. Someone was expecting him, counting on him, looking forward to seeing him. Harbour had given him something he didn't know he'd been missing, a purpose beyond his grief, a reason to get up in the morning that had nothing to do with his past, and everything to do with his future. Yet even as Edmund felt this new sense of possibility opening up inside him, a part of him wondered if he was ready for all the changes Harbour seemed determined to bring to his life. Because, as he was about to discover, the community garden was just the beginning of his cat's grand plan for pulling him back into the world of the living. Summer arrived in Providence with the kind of heat that made even the heartiest New Englanders question their commitment to 4 seasons. Edmund's community garden volunteering had become the highlight of his week, and Harbour had achieved something approaching celebrity status among the parish volunteers. The cat seemed to understand instinctively which plants needed water, which insects were beneficial, and which volunteers needed a gentle head bump of encouragement. But it was on a sweltering Tuesday in July that Harbour orchestrated his most ambitious plan yet. Edmund was in his kitchen preparing for another day at the garden when he heard an unfamiliar sound from upstairs, a soft thudding as if something was being knocked over repeatedly. His first thought was that Harbour had somehow gotten trapped in one of the rooms he rarely used. "Harbour!" he called, then listened. The sound came again, definitely from the second floor. He climbed the stairs with growing concern, following the intermittent thudding to its source. His heart nearly stopped when he realized where the sound was coming from. The locked room. Clara's room. "Harbour!" Edmund called again, his voice tight with anxiety. The thudding stopped, replaced by a familiar meow that was definitely coming from behind the white door. Edmund stood frozen in the hallway, his hand hovering over the key he'd kept in his pocket for 3 years. He'd carried it everywhere, a talisman of his grief, never intending to use it, but unable to put it away. Now faced with Harbour's predicament, he had no choice. The key turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been waiting patiently for this moment. As the door swung open, Edmund was hit by a wave of scent that nearly brought him to his knees. Lavender sachets Clara had made, the vanilla candles she'd loved, and underneath it all, the indefinable fragrance that had been uniquely hers. Harbour sat in the middle of the room, perfectly calm, surrounded by scattered papers and an overturned box. He looked at Edmund with those knowing amber eyes and purred as if to say, "Finally." Edmund stepped into the room on trembling legs. Nothing had been disturbed except for the box Harbour had apparently been investigating. Sunlight streamed through windows Edmund had forgotten were there, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. Clara's reading chair sat exactly where she'd left it, a half-finished book, still marked with her flower-pressed bookmark on the side table. Her writing desk held neat stacks of correspondence, recipe cards, and what looked like the beginnings of stories she'd never finished. The room breathed with her presence, but for the first time in 3 years, Edmund felt welcomed rather than haunted by it. Harbour had positioned himself next to the overturned box, and as Edmund approached, he could see what the cat had been trying to show him. The scattered papers were letters, not just any letters, but the ones Clara had been writing in her final months. Letters to him. With shaking hands, Edmund picked up the nearest page. "My darling Edmund, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you finally found the courage to come back into this room. I know how hard this must be for you, but I need you to hear what I couldn't say when I was sick and scared and trying to be brave for both of us." Edmund sank into Clara's chair, Harbour immediately jumping into his lap as he continued reading. "I'm not worried about dying, my love. I'm worried about you living. You have so much to give the world. So much kindness and knowledge and love that shouldn't die with me. Promise me you won't let grief become a prison. Promise me you'll find ways to let people need you again, because being needed is what makes you shine brightest." Tears Edmund had held back for years began to flow as he read letter after letter. Clara had written about their garden, about his gentle way with plants and people, about her hope that he would find community and purpose after she was gone. She'd written about specific neighbors, predicting with uncanny accuracy that Mrs. Chen would need garden advice, that the parish would benefit from his expertise, that somewhere in Providence there were people waiting for the gifts only he could give. The final letter was different, shorter, written in Clara's increasingly shaky handwriting. "I had the strangest dream last night, Edmund. I dreamed that a blue-grey cat would come to you when you needed him most. He would be persistent and wise, and he would help you remember that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to express itself. I know it sounds silly, but when you meet this cat, and you will meet him, name him Harbour, because that's what he'll be for you. a safe harbor in the storm of grief and eventually a lighthouse guiding you back to shore. Edmund's hands shook as he looked down at Harbour, who was purring with unusual intensity, his amber eyes fixed on Edmund's face with unmistakable love and understanding. "She knew," Edmund whispered. "Somehow, she knew you were coming." Harbour's purr deepened, and the cat gently placed a paw on the letter, as if blessing the words Clara had written months before they'd ever met. Over the following weeks, Edmund began the slow process of sorting through Clara's belongings, but this time it felt like preservation rather than burial. He kept her writing desk exactly as she'd left it, but he moved her chair downstairs to the living room, where it could be part of daily life again. He donated her clothes to the parish clothing drive, knowing she would have loved the idea of her favorite dresses bringing comfort to other women. Most importantly, he followed through on Clara's written wishes. He expanded his involvement at the community garden, eventually taking over as coordinator when Father Michael was transferred to another parish. He started a neighborhood seed exchange, teaching families how to grow their own vegetables in small spaces. He even began writing a simple gardening guide for New England beginners, something Clara had encouraged him to do for years. Harbour supervised all of these activities with the satisfaction of a project manager, whose long-term plan was finally coming to fruition. The cat had somehow understood from the beginning what Edmund needed most. Not just companionship, but purpose. Not just comfort, but community. Not just survival, but the courage to truly live again. On a crisp September morning, exactly 1 year after Harbour had first appeared at his door, Edmund sat on his front porch reading the newspaper. The community garden had just had its most successful harvest ever, providing fresh vegetables for over 60 families through the food pantry. His neighborhood seed exchange had grown into a city-wide program. Most surprisingly, his gardening guide had been accepted for publication by a small press that specialized in practical guides for seniors. Harbour lay stretched across his lap, purring contentedly as Edmund scratched behind his ears. The morning sun painted everything golden, and the sound of children walking to school filled the air with the promise of another day full of possibilities. "You knew, didn't you?" Edmund asked Harbour quietly. "From that first night, you knew exactly what needed to happen." Harbour opened one amber eye and regarded Edmund with what could only be described as a smile. Then he closed his eye again and resumed purring, the sound rumbling through both of them like a small engine of contentment. Edmund looked up at the second-floor window that had once represented everything he'd lost. Now it was just a window, letting light into a room that had become part of his life again, rather than a shrine to his grief. Clara's letters were framed on the wall of his study, reminders not of what had ended, but of what continued. As Harbour had taught him, and as Clara's letters had confirmed, love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It transforms, finding new expressions in community gardens and neighborhood friendships, in shared knowledge and open doors, in the simple act of allowing yourself to be needed by others. The blue-gray cat who had arrived in a storm and refused to leave had done more than save Edmund from loneliness. Harbour had returned him to life itself, one persistent purr, one open door, one act of connection at a time. And in the warmth of a September morning, with Harbour purring in his lap and neighbours waving as they passed his house, Edmund Hale understood that some harbours aren't places you leave behind, but sanctuaries you carry with you wherever love leads you next. The door to Clara's room stood open now, filled with morning light and the promise that no door, not even those locked by grief, has to stay closed forever. Sometimes all it takes is a wise cat, a loving community, and the courage to remember that being needed is just another way of saying you're alive.